Okay, so it's 2-3 by my watch. Still the same 13 people, but I think we can start with your permission. We can start so that the others can join us as the presentation is ongoing. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. And you are welcome to the very last session of the Competitive Matching Grant webinar series. The topic for discussion this afternoon is climate smart agribusiness. My name is Ernestina Ponsa, and I'll be moderating today's session. So before I continue, I would like to indicate that this webinar is being recorded. So you joining this particular webinar is presumed that you have consented for you to be part of the recording. But at every point in time, if you have any question, you can type in your question in the chat button. Before we continue, I would like you to kindly indicate your name, the organization that you are working with, as well as the country that you are joining this webinar from. And in as much as possible, kindly mute your microphones during this particular session. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session whereby participants will be given the opportunity to ask their questions. But in the course of the presentation, like as I earlier indicated, if you have any comments, you need clarifications, or you have any questions, you can also type in the chat session, and there are some colleagues that will answer those questions for you. So I would want us to more or less like briefly recapitulate some key points concerning this particular third call. So for this particular third call, the launch of the third call came off successfully on the 8th of July 2024. And we are anticipating that we'll receive the concept notes by the 18th of August 2024 by 12 p.m. I would also like to indicate that members coming from the OACPS state, that is the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, Pacific States, are eligible to apply for this particular call. And for this particular call, the value chain that we are focusing on are cashews, cocoa, maize, and livestock. And the project should focus on increasing income along the value chain, climate change mitigation, adaptation, and gender transformative approaches. But I also want to indicate that all information will be made available on our website. And I'll be posting these or sharing the links to our website in the chat shortly. So you can always visit our website for additional information. So on that note, I will just want us to take a look at the agenda for today's webinar session. So I would like to indicate that the joint action, which is the business support facility for resilient agricultural value chains, is focusing on, or it's aimed to contribute to economic and climate change resilience. So we are organizing this particular webinar series to help you understand the expectations regarding the measures to work towards climate resilience by implementing climate smart agribusiness. So for the agenda for today's webinar, we'll be taking a look at what climate resilient is, and we would also take a look at climate smart agribusiness, focusing on the practices and some examples. And then we'll take a look at the human capacity development for climate smart agribusiness. And another topic that we'll be delving in will be the new regulations on the European Union, gender, youth, and climate change. And then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. So on that note, I would want us to zoom into the presentation. But before I do so, I'd like to give a short profile or introduce who our presenter will be. The presenter for today's webinar session is an advisor with the Agri-Business Facility Project, and her focus is on human capacity development, and she's also the focal point when it comes to climate change and the youth. She also has experience when it comes to climate policy, rural youth employment, and migration. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome our presenter in the person of Regina Kessler. So over to you, Regina. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernestina, for setting the theme, and also a warm welcome from my side. Yes, I'm happy to have the opportunity to provide this input on climate resilience and climate smart agriculture and agribusiness to you today. So to really help you understand the expectations that we have regarding climate resilience, and to give you some more also practical guidance for your concept notes that you hopefully submit in the context of our competitive matching grant scheme. So maybe to get us started, I would be interested to hear from you. What kind of impacts of climate change can you observe in your context, in your country? So what kind of changes in weather or climate patterns can you observe, and how do they already affect the agricultural value chains that you work in and the related agribusinesses? So please feel free to put an answer in the chat. Maybe while you do so and reflect on what climate change impacts you might already face, I can also share some personal experience. I'm also coming myself from a family farm. And what we really can observe here in Germany is that we can see more irregular weather patterns and also more extreme weather. So this year, we have really seen lots of rain and lots of heavy rains that also resulted in some flooding, and were accompanied by some severe thunderstorms with also hail. So all those weather extremes that we could observe this year will definitely also have an impact on our yields and our productivity, I guess. And yes, I can also already see like one answer in the chat that in Nigeria there is the impact of droughts, which really also leads to reduced yields and the incidence of pests and diseases. So yes, I think this is an impact of climate change that many of you in other countries will also probably observe themselves. So increasing temperatures, droughts, floods, irregular rainfall patterns is something that we see in many countries. And there is another answer that flooding has also happened in Kenya. Yes, we have seen that also in the news, that flooding was quite an issue in Kenya this year. So yeah, I think what we can say is when we think about projects that really want to address agricultural value chains and support agribusinesses, bringing in this climate change perspective and trying to work towards more climate resilience and adapt to this impacts, it is a must today. We cannot design a project without having this climate change impact in our mind, because it has become really a reality in many places. So as Ernestina has already said, is that the first thing that we would like to do with you is to create really a common understanding of what do we really mean by climate resilience and climate smart agribusiness. So you also have like a strong foundation when you come to design your concept notes and know what we would like to see in the context of climate change. So to very, very briefly go back to the very scratch, we all know agriculture, agribusiness means working with and in nature, and therefore agribusinesses are directly and highly impacted by weather and climate, and therefore also climate change. So we have already started to discuss a bit what we observe and how it makes agriculture and agribusiness a bit more challenging nowadays. At the same time, we are also all aware that unsustainable agri-food systems, be it intentionally or unintentionally building on unsustainable production methods or unsustainable management of natural resources, are also again contributors to climate change, because they result in the emission of greenhouse gases, which are the main driver of global warming and therefore also climate change. And when both of those aspects come together, the impacts that climate change already has on agribusinesses and agri-food systems and the contribution that our agri-food systems make to climate change, what we see is that this creates and increases climate vulnerability. So what do we mean when we speak of climate vulnerability? It is the likelihood or predisposition to be adversely affected by the impacts of climate change. And here again, we have already also started to touch upon some of the direct or primary and secondary impacts that we can see, that increasing temperatures result in droughts, or the heavy rains result in flooding, and then this impacts the yields and the productivity on our fields, and it gets really more difficult for our smallholder farmers, for our agripreneurs to be able to create their incomes, etc. So what we really need, and this is where we want to bring you in with your innovative ideas in the context of our matching grant fund, is to address the climate vulnerability and instead strengthen and increase climate resilience. So what do we mean by climate resilience? From our perspective, it describes the capacity of agricultural systems, ecosystems, communities, agripreneurs, so everyone that is really an actor along the value chains, to prepare for, to respond to, and also to recover from the impacts of climate change in a way to maintain productivity, functionality, and sustainability, and also keeping those damages minimal that we cannot avoid or prevent at all. So this, to be able to do so, also requires that everybody understands the climate risks that impact them. And therefore, we need the capacity not only to adapt, but also to learn and transform accordingly. So this is also the reason, or one of the reasons, why in the context of our matching grant fund and the call for concept notes, one of the key elements that we put so much focus on is human capacity development, because what we can clearly also observe is that due to insufficient capacities, the resilience of actors along the entire value chains, and in particular of micro and small and medium enterprises, is often low to very low, while the climate change related impacts are further reinforcing their vulnerability. So to really be able to transform our agri-food systems, strengthen value chains and their resilience, we need to make everybody understand why is this happening and what is happening and what do we need to change, and then of course also how can we really do that, how can we transform. And I'm quite convinced that if we tackle this aspect, building on your innovative ideas, we can make a huge impact. So climate smart agribusiness can be quite a good and strong foundation to work towards this climate resilience. What do we mean by climate smart agribusiness? Many of you probably already heard of climate smart agriculture, which is a well-established and highly accepted approach or concept that was built by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the United Nations. We like to speak of climate smart agribusiness as we do not only want to focus on the production segment of the value chain, but on all the segments along the value chain. So from production to processing to marketing, etc. But still we build on this climate smart agriculture approach of the FAO when we speak of climate smart agribusiness that has 3 interlinked objectives that all are also important for us and therefore for the matching grant fund in your concept notes. So these objectives are, first, to sustainably increase the agricultural productivity and incomes of the actors, which then results in an increase of food security. The second objective is the adaptation perspective, so to adapt and build resilience to climate change. And the third dimension is reducing and or removing greenhouse gases where possible. So really also to bring in the mitigation perspective. As a last building block, maybe of this more theoretical input with all the definitions, let me quickly also elaborate on what do we mean by this adaptation and mitigation, reduction and removing, because this is something that you can or should also work with when it comes to your concept notes and when you think about, how can we really strengthen climate resilience with our innovative ideas. So adaptation for us summarizes all proactive adjustment measures and strategies to actual or future thus expected climate change impacts with the aim to reduce the vulnerability of ecosystems and communities and agripreneurs. So here we really focus on the impacts of climate change that we might already experience or that are very likely to come in the near future, and how to address them, how to cope with them, or how to address their negative impacts. Mitigation, on the other hand, summarizes all efforts to prevent or reduce emissions of greenhouse gases as the main driver of climate change, or to even enhance their removal from the atmosphere. So here we having really on a focus on addressing the drivers of climate change and to contribute to fight further climate change and the negative impact. Maybe let me quickly also, as a last point, explain or present to you what we mean by reduction and removal and storage as the two subcategories when it comes to mitigation. So when we have a look at reduction, we really would like to see you to identify, develop, and apply measures and strategies along the entire value chain that result in minimizing the release of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the two main ways of doing that is to, on the one hand, improve current practices, so they result in less greenhouse gas emissions, or to even find alternative practices that do not result in the release of greenhouse gases at all, or at least in less greenhouse gas emissions. The removal or storage, and this is often used as synonyms, focuses more on identifying, developing, and applying measures and strategies along the value chain that do not only contribute to reduce greenhouse gases, but focus on absorbing them from the atmosphere and store them long-term in sinks. And such things could be trees, so forests, but also soils and grasslands. So really reduce their greenhouse gases, not just because we do something differently, but we really take them out of the atmosphere. So to get maybe a bit more concrete, let's maybe have a look on how could you bring in this climate resilience perspective in your concept note. So maybe you already have an idea, maybe you already know what you want to do, but maybe you do not really know yet or are unsure of the climate dimension that could be a fit for your concept note. In whatever your situation you are, it is always beneficial to start with an environmental analysis or a climate risk assessment for your specific context to either explore what climate resilience perspective you could bring in, or to even validate your ideas that you already have developed. Here on the slide, what you can see is like a very simple tool that you can build on to really do a first assessment, a first analysis for your value chain and the agribusinesses that act in this value chain to assess, the agribusinesses in my value chain, let's maybe take, for example, maize. Do they cause negative impacts when it comes to climate change? So I don't know, maybe you do see practices like deforestation, that forests are cleared to make more land arable for the maize production, which would not be good in terms of climate change because then we release more greenhouse gases. On the other hand, think about how are the enterprises, the agribusinesses in my value chain affected by climate change. So we've already started to talk about, okay, we see, I don't know, more droughts or irregular rainfall patterns, and this obviously can have an impact on the yields, the crop development. They might not mature as good as they did before, or they might even be destructed at all. So how can you counteract those negative impacts that climate change has on the agribusinesses. But then also think about the opportunities that come along for your enterprises, such as contributing to compensating emissions, and all the other opportunities. So I don't know, maybe establishing an agroforestry system for your maize production, and the trees that you plant then can really also absorb the carbon in. So really try as a first step to analyze the climate risks that you have, to have this analysis, and then from this point on you can move forward and think, what climate smart agribusiness practices could be a fit for my context, for my specific local context, that I could bring in and that we could apply to either adapt to the impacts of climate change or to contribute to mitigation. So here on this side, you can see a first collection of some examples for the value chains, the 4 value chains that we focus on in the context of our MGF, so cocoa, maize, cashew, but also livestock. And livestock, we have a dedicated focus on cattle, sheep, and goats. I will not present all of them to you right now, but maybe let me give you an example for all 3 categories. So maybe if we look at adaptation and the maize value chain. So there is various climate smart practices that you could consider that could be helpful to counteract or to address the impacts of climate change. So it could be using stress or heat resilient seeds when there is a drought. You could use minimum tillage or mulching for soil water conservation that could be helpful. Or you could also think about planting hedges and shrubs to really also decrease surface runoff and soil erosion. When we look at reduction, then in the livestock value chain, we also produce manure, as you know, and a manure, of course, can be an important source as an organic fertilizer for our crop production. So we have a positive side effect, but manure management is really, really important when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So the correct or the sustainable management of manure can really have an impact to also reduce greenhouse gases, be it when it comes to the correct storage of manure, but also when we apply the manure on the field. So to rather apply it when soils are wet than dry or the air temperatures are lower. And then maybe last but not least, as an example for removal or storage, we have already mentioned that agroforestry systems are quite a climate smart practice that can really have a great impact on also removing or storing greenhouse gas emissions. So when we have a look at our cashew value chain, establishing those agroforestry systems can not only have like a positive impact when it comes to adaptation, because we have like a positive impact on soil health or water conservation. The trees might produce the shade for crops underneath it, but the cashew trees also have this potential to store greenhouse gases, the carbon, and this can even be a business opportunity for the smallholder farmers, because they could create or generate carbon credits that can be sold on carbon markets and generate like an additional income for the smallholder farmers. Let me just quickly make a break. I know this is lots of input, lots of concepts, lots of definitions, lots of different examples. Don't worry if you don't memorize everything by heart right now. Obviously, we will share the presentation and also recording of this webinar after we have concluded on our website. So you can just go back, have another look in a calm moment, and then look at all the information once again so you can really use it for your concept note. We have also produced, let's say, a quite comprehensive but not exhaustive overview of other climate smart agribusiness practices that might be an option for you. I will not go through it all in detail because I think we would all fall asleep if I just read them right now. But as you can see, we have clustered them in different categories. So you can also have like a look for more inspiration There is practices on soil management or livestock management. We have other options for crop production or water conservation. We have already talked about agroforestry as an option, but obviously you could also think about energy, like renewable energies that could come in, or also in other segments along the value chain, have a look at what could be a fit for you when it comes to processing or storage or even marketing. In this context, maybe it's also good to always remember that there are quite, let's say, some climate smart practices that you can find over and over again. But bringing you back to the climate risk assessments, always ensure that there is no one size fits all solution. So you cannot always say, okay, there is a drought, so I will always do, I don't know, a minimum tillage and all my problems will be gone. So really consider your local specific context. What is the best fit when it comes to the impacts? What is the best fit when it comes to the resources, the natural resources, but also the resources of your target group, and then make an informed decision what practices would be best in this specific context. As a last step, I would like to present two really concrete examples that we have developed to give you an idea how the climate resilience component could look like in your project design. Before I go into more detail to explain them, let me mention that we are fully aware that right now these examples are really fully developed or very detailed. We have an objective and outputs and activities and indicators. And please don't worry, we are fully aware we are still at the concept note stage. We are only asking for a concept note. We are aware that you have a template to use that we provide with you, and there's only limited space where you can put in information. So right now it is not necessary yet to have like this fully developed matrix with all the activities and indicators, etc. Rather, we wanted to present these examples in this way for you to give you some orientation, and then obviously also as maybe some food for thought for later when you continue to develop your idea, maybe into a fully fledged proposal on how it could look like. So please, as again, we are aware it's the concept note stage. Yes, of course, we want to see that your objectives make sense, but there is no need to have like a fully developed matrix yet. But let me go back to the examples and maybe start with one example that would focus on the cashew value chain and have a focus on adaptation measures. So for our example, the objective of our example project would be that we want to improve the productivity, and by doing so also the income of cashew farmers, both female and male, through the adoption of climate smart agricultural practices. So one of the outputs to reach this objective could be that the cashew agripreneurs apply climate smart production practices that fit their context best. And as you can see under the activities, there are a couple of practices available. This could be using drought-resistant varieties, thinning, pruning, drip irrigation, or integrated pest management, and many others. To allow our smallholder farmers, our cashew farmers, that they can improve their productivity by using those climate smart production practices, one of the activities could be that we conduct training sessions on those practices that will allow the cashew farmers to understand them, but then obviously also to apply them, to really implement and use them. So we conduct the technical trainings, and to maybe accompany the trainings and really ensure that we have like a good implementation of that. Another activity could be that we establish demonstration fields in selected districts where the farmers could see on how those good agricultural practices are really implemented. Plus, as another activity, we could also conduct farmer field fora in the districts where all the actors involved, including the farmers, could exchange on their experiences and lessons learned. indicators to monitor and to measure if our activities really result in achieving our outputs could, for example, be the number of cashew farmers that we train in the climate smart production practices. Whereas because we want to have women included, we want to have youth included, so we also really want to have inclusive approaches, we would want to see a 50-50 ratio for male and also 50% youth participation. So that's why we included it in our indicator. Another indicator to really also monitor and show that we contribute to strengthening climate resilience is that we have this indicator on the strategies developed for climate smart production practices. And here we would say we want to develop 4 strategies because we have those 4 different measures: the use of the drought resistant varieties, canopy substitution, drip irrigation, as well as mulching. And this all would then contribute to the adaptation to impacts of climate change. Another example would be that we right now shift our focus on the removal and have a look at the livestock value chain for that. So the objective of our example project would right now be that we also want to improve livelihoods and income of our female and male livestock farmers. And right now we want to do so by increasing the economic value of marginalized lands for sustainably intensified low emission production. So what does it mean, or how could the outputs look like to reach this objective? Again, we want obviously to enhance the skills of our livestock farmers, and as we are convinced that the combination of technical training or the training that focuses on technical skills in combination with also providing them with agribusiness or entrepreneurship skills is the best way forward because it really builds synergies. Here we really want to do trainings the technical training that allows them to implement sustainable agroforestry livestock practices on marginalized lands, so really the technical side, but then also to improve their economics and investment for more income, so to have this entrepreneurship skill side. And another output could be then, because we do not only want to provide them with the skills to capacitate our livestock farmers, we also want to really see the implementation. So the second output could be that agroforestry sites are established on marginalized lands, which results in extending the grazing areas for the animals of the farmers, while contributing to storing carbon because we have the trees right now on the marginalized lands. Activities could be then again very similar when we come to skills development that we run on the one hand technical trainings, but then on the other hand also the agribusiness trainings that really also allow the farmers to learn more about planning, financial management and investment, and therefore then also allow them to make informed decisions that really also result in a generation of additional income. And indicators, as you can see, are also quite similar as in our example before. So we would again have an indicator on the number of participants that were trained. In this case, we want to have a 50-50% ratio for male and female. And this project has a very strong focus on young people and even wants to include 80% and not just the 50% that we would like to see. In addition, there are also indicators again for the strategies for climate resilience to really prove that, there are some strategies that have been developed. Plus, this project goes like a step further because it really also has this focus on removal of greenhouse gases and would include an indicator that, methods with the potential to remove and store greenhouse gases have been developed and implemented to also prove that with the agroforestry systems, they work towards the CO2 removal or storage. I have already mentioned a couple of times, and this is why I would quickly want to come back as a refresher right now, that human capacity development is really also a key component that we see crucial in the context of our matching grant funds. So to really capacitate our target groups with the right skills, be it technical, be it entrepreneurial, to really allow them to implement all the measures, including the climate smart agribusiness practices, and to really then be able to make the impact that we want to see. We already had a dedicated webinar on all the human capacity development tools and instruments and approaches that we from GIZ side have in our portfolio that could be interesting for you to maybe use in the context of your project. So have another look at also the webinar and the presentation, the fully fledged one on human capacity development, to see if there is a fit for you in there. But let me maybe quickly mention some of the approaches and instruments that have a specific focus, or at least like an integral part when it comes to climate resilience and climate smart agribusiness. To start with, let me quickly mention our Farmer Business School, which is a training approach that has like a strong focus on capacitating smallholder farmers with agribusiness skills. And the Farmer Business School Climate right now is an extended version that still capacitates the smallholder farmers with the agribusiness skills, but in addition and at the same time, right now also strengthens their capacities on climate resilient practices in an integrated manner. So participants would learn about climate change in general, the impacts, but then also obviously on specific practices that they could maybe use for their value chain and their context, because the training materials for our farmer business schools are always adapted to those contexts. The adaptation, or a tool that we use for the adaptation and have developed, is a climate change tool. It's an Excel-based tool to really identify adaptation strategies and some mitigation strategies for crops and livestock produced under climatic risk in different ecozones. So to really facilitate the adaptation of training materials, in a straightforward manner that also makes it easily accessible for the smallholder farmers that do the trainings to understand climate change and the practices that they could use in their context. When it comes to cashew, we also have a dedicated training manual on conservation agriculture and its principles that really also constitutes a major approach to climate change adaptation and tailored at building the adaptive capacity of smallholder farmers in a sustainable manner that really want to build on practices with regards to conservation agriculture. In addition, we also have those technical economic producer references, which means like really, let's say, guides on good agricultural practices for the different value chains, including, for example, on cashew, which provide concise, correct, and compelling documentation, and maybe even more important, illustrations of good agricultural practices, as well as practices on harvest and post-harvest techniques. And the compilation of these gaps obviously also include climate smart agribusiness practices. The same is available for our other value chains, in particularly also maize and cocoa. And you could also see if this is maybe a fit for your concept notes to use those producer references for your projects. Last but not least, I would also like to mention once again our Agribusiness e-Academy, which is an online platform or learning platform with freely accessible online trainings that you can do self-paced. And we have on the one hand some, let's say, producer references also available as an online version. So it would be 3D animated courses, for example, on a gap in the maize value chain. But I would also like to specifically mention that we are currently working on 3 dedicated courses on climate smart agribusiness, with the first course on climate smart agribusiness essentials hopefully coming very soon after the summer break. So in this course, learners can really learn all the background information on climate change in general, but then also the impacts it has on agribusiness and agriculture more specifically, also in a very straightforward and easily accessible way. In addition, later this year, we will also release 2 more courses, one that has a specific focus on adaptation and a second one or a third course with a specific focus on mitigation. And they will also explain what do we actually mean with adaptation and mitigation, but then also give plenty of practical experience to make it more tangible for our learners. Okay, I know this has been already a lot of information, but let me touch upon 2 more important aspects, which are the new EU regulations that might be important for you, as well as the strong interlinkages of climate change, women, and youth. First, the new regulations of the European Union. And here I would also quickly like to mention and stress that working with those EU regulations or bringing them in your concept notes is not mandatory at all per se. The reason why we want to mention is that in some very specific cases, so if you work on a particular value chain and are interested, for example, in promoting trade or export to the European Union, then in this specific case, it might be necessary to take into account that there are new EU regulations. But it's not, just to stress that one more time, in general mandatory to have those EU regulations in mind. So the first EU regulation is the regulation on deforestation-free products, or in short called AUDR. The background of AUDR is the trend that we see in some countries that we have deforestation, that there is an expansion of agricultural land that is linked to the production of commodities or value chains such as cattle, wood, cocoa, or coffee. And you can already see with cattle and cocoa, we already have like 2 value chains in there that are part of our matching grant fund. And in future, this might also maybe be something that touches the cashew value chain. So that, just to mention, but for the time being, right now it's cattle and cocoa. As the European Union is a major economy and a consumer of commodities from those value chains that might be linked to activities like deforestation or forest degradation, the EU is also partially responsible for those issues and wants to address them, wants to address those issues, wants to do something against the deforestation. And this is why they came up with this deregulation on deforestation-free products. So under the regulation, any operator or trader who places commodities from those value chains on the EU market or exports from it must be able to prove that the products do not originate from recently deforested land or have contributed to forest degradation. So maybe to make this a bit more tangible, if you want to submit a concept note that focuses on the production of leather in the context of the value chain cattle, and you have the aim to export that leather to the European Union, then I would recommend for you to have a look at the UDR, because then it will be relevant for you. If you plan to submit a concept note focusing on the livestock value chain and manure management in your region or your country, then the regulations are probably not touching upon you. So just to be clear on that once again. The second regulation that I would quickly like to mention as well is the so-called Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also short called CSDDD. So what's the background of that one? Roughly speaking, the CSDDD establishes a corporate due diligence duty, meaning that companies need to identify and address potential and actual adverse human rights and environmental impacts in their own operations, subsidiaries, and business partners. So a company really has to then prove that those adverse human rights and environmental impacts cannot be found in their supply chain or in their operation. So I think one very common example that is often used is we have a company that buys cocoa and wants to produce chocolate that will be sold in the European Union, has to prove then that the cocoa they buy is child labor free. So this would be one of the adverse human rights issues. So the focus is really also on human rights. Also, just to mention, if you should by any chance want to work on placing products on the European market, also keep this directive in your mind. However, the EU has just approved this directive, and there will still be some time, like a transition period, until it becomes really mandatory. But maybe it's also good to just keep that in mind. So we just wanted to mention those two EU regulations to raise awareness that if this should touch upon your specific project idea, maybe it could make sense to get some more information. But as I said before, it's not mandatory for all concept notes. Last but not least, because this is also very important to me personally, but also in the context of our matching grant fund, as you know, we put a particular focus on women and youth. When it comes to the target groups, is to mention the very strong interlinkages that we can see on climate change, the impact of climate change, and gender and youth, as the impacts that we see from climate change affect different groups in different manners, and often it's those groups that are already marginalized per se that also experience like even more severe effects of the impacts of climate change, among them women and youth. So obviously we already want to see you to bring in the gender and youth perspective per se. And we also had like a dedicated webinar on gender empowerment. So please also go back and review the presentation or have a look at the recording. Our colleagues have made a wonderful presentation on how really to bring in the gender empowerment. But don't think in silos. Really, when you think of climate resilience and gender empowerment, make sure to consider them as interlinked areas, because there are so many touch points. Because just to give you maybe one more concrete example is female agripreneurs in general already have like more limited access when it comes to resources and inputs, etc. And this is also true when it comes to climate-related resources and inputs, and their ability or their capacities, for example, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So they have limited access to weather forecasts or extension services that could be helpful for the implementation of climate resilience practices. And obviously, we have like a great potential that we do not use if we neglect this gender perspective also when it comes to climate change. And this is why, for example, right now, when we look at, let it be extreme weather events, such as storms, that they are way more often more dangerous and deadly for women. So, for example, one good statistics is that for a tsunami that hit many Asian countries in 2004, 70% of people who died were women. So this really illustrates, what an impact climate change can also have for women. So the message I want to send you right now is bring in the gender perspective. Also, when you think about how to address climate change, how to adapt and how to mitigate, because not just because it's fair, but because it will also help you to maximize your impact. Ensure that climate resilient practices, for example, build up assets, the asset base of women, and ensure that mitigation and adaptation efforts also address sources of gender inequality and poverty, because this will really maximize your impact. Last but not least, the same is true for young women and men that often also face constraints when it comes to access to resources as land and finance, but also bring in this youth perspective to really maximize your impact by building on inclusive approaches for your project design with a strong focus on not just women, but also young people. Ensure that your climate resilient practices consider the specific needs of young women and men, because this will also allow you to tap the great potential that young women and men bring along as agents of change and innovation. And as you know, in many countries, we see that we have a large young population, a large youth bulge that we really should take advantage of. Whew, that was a lot of input. Thank you very much for listening until the end here. Again, we will share all information on our website. We will post the link to our websites once again in the chat. You can find not only the PowerPoint slides and the webinar recordings for this webinar on climate change, but on all other topics that we touched upon during the last 2 weeks. So you can go back and find all the information. And yes, I think I came to the end of my input and would hand back to Ernestina so we can have like a Q&A if there are any questions from your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Regina, for such an insightful presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you. So at this juncture, the floor is open for questions. So if you want to ask any question, kindly use the hand raise button, be called, and then you can unmute and speak. If you don't want to speak, you could also type in your question in the chat section. So I'll wait for 2 minutes. I don't see any hands raised. Neither do I see questions in the chat. So as I'm waiting, I would want to indicate that this is the very last webinar series on the Competitive Matching Grant Fund. And as Regina said, all other information will be made available on our website, which I have shared in the chat section. So kindly visit our website for further information. Okay, so I see one comment here from Nat. Thank you, very helpful. Are you able to share the link for the slides as well, or will they be available on the website? They will all be available on the website, Nat. So kindly visit our link and then you'll find them there. Okay. Any other? Okay, so, and I noticed that they are silent. Everybody is silent. So I am presuming that we have all understood the presentation and there are no questions. Okay, so just a little bit of announcement. Please note that the final deadline for submission for the concept notes is on the 18th of August 2024. So please, let's be mindful of this particular date. And we are all looking forward to receiving your wonderful concept notes with very innovative ideas. So on that note, I'd like to thank Regina very much for making herself available presentation. I also like to thank all participants for joining us from your respective locations. So do visit our website for more information and do have a good continuation for the day. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Bye-bye from my end.
Thank you very much. Have a good day and good luck.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Ernestina. Thank you, Regina. Bye-bye.